All right, we are going to kick this off because it is Friday and we are going to repot and learn about propagation for all of our plants today. Again, for those watching at home, my name is Nick Cutsumpas, Farmer Nick, NYC, and I'm coming at you live from the seat of my pants in my parents' attic because today we are going to be replanting some of the many plants in my collection that are in serious need of a little bit of a refresh and a revamp. So there's a lot of things that we covered last week, specifically around what to assess in your environment, how to go about picking plants. Now we've reached this third step. So we've bought our plant, right? We have our beautiful, in this case, we have a Fiddly fig, right? This is a plant that we brought home. It's currently in its plastic nursery pot, and we need to figure out how to create the best home for it. Now, to do this, there are many steps, but the idea is that we want to be able to figure out how best to take this plant out of here without harming the plant, without harming too many of the roots, and then putting it in here. Now, it's easier said than done, and repotting can be a very stressful thing for a lot of people. That being said, I think that there are a couple different ways that you can learn to repot in an easy way, ways that are a little bit more advanced that can help you and the plant, have a prolonged longevity as opposed to something that's a temporary fix. But we're going to cover a bunch of different methods today. And in the second half of the class, we're going to talk about, okay, once your plants are fully established, how then can you go about propagating them, which is a whole different thing about multiplying and cloning plants. So let's pretend that we got this Fiddly fig the other day. I picked this up actually a week ago, and now this is probably actually a good time for me to repot it. I don't repot necessarily right away. I just wanted to put it usually in quarantine in the bathroom to make sure that there's no pests or anything in the next few days. And now it's pretty good. It's ready for a watering and it's ready for a repotting. So what I'm going to do are a couple things. The first thing I'm going to do, and then I'll look into the soil just to make sure that the roots are they're going to be at the top of the nursery pot because they've been in here for a while. And I don't know if you can see that in here, but you can definitely see some roots at the top of the soil here, which indicates to me that this plant is probably ready to be repotted. Now, why do we repot? We repot because we want the plant to have room to grow and expand its roots. Oftentimes in these nurseries, these can be in the nursery pots for many, many weeks, sometimes even longer. And we want to make sure that we're giving it room to grow and flourish in its new environment. Now, the nursery pots are a pain in the butt because they're plastic. I end up saving mine because I want to, try and avoid putting them in a landfill. But the goal here is you're going to want to put it in some kind of new pot. The pots and planters that we see around in Home Depot or at Crate and Barrel, they vary tremendously in price. They vary tremendously in quality, materials. There's a lot of information out there. To be honest, any planter's work, all it is just understanding how to create the right conditions for your plant to survive. Now, this is a planter that is plastic based, and it does not have a drainage hole. Now, I know we spoke a lot about that in the previous class, but the most important thing for a plant in any situation is drainage. And how you create drainage for a plant that doesn't have, or a planter that doesn't have a drainage hole is the key. So we're going to be going through that, and we're going to be planting this Fiddly fig inside this pot. Now, how did I choose this pot, and how did I know it's the right fit for the Fiddly fig? Now, to do that, and I had my tape measure here somewhere, which I'll have to track down at some point, but you're going to have to trust me on this. What I did is I measured the diameter of this nursery pot. So the diameter is going to be from one end of the circle to the other end across the middle. Now, the rule of thumb is that all plants that are repotted should be roughly 1 to 2 inches less than the planter you're putting in. So I'll say that again. The nursery pot should be 1 to 2 inches less than the new planter that you're about to plant it in. So this is a 9-inch nursery pot. This is an 11-inch planter. Perfect. That's going to give it some room to grow, going to put some soil around the edges, and it's going to create a little bit larger environment for the plant to expand. Now, it's very similar to, a hermit crab or something that needs to get a new shell. Plants are going to need repotting as they grow. You don't want them to become what's called root bound. When they're root bound, it means that the roots are traveling and crossing and crisscrossing and circling around that nursery pot, and eventually they're going to be very, very constricted. And once that happens, the ability to uptake nutrients becomes rather difficult. So we don't want them to become too root bound, and we want them to be able to expand, sort of tease out the roots a little bit, and then plant them in the planter. Now, it's important to recognize which plants actually prefer being a little bit more root bound versus others that actually prefer to be truly like broken out. So this Monstera here, this is something that is a plant that is so hardy and so resistant to a lot of things. You could literally break apart the roots and it would be totally fine. Now, in other situations like the Fiddly fig, which likes to be a little bit more root bound, I'm not going to break out the roots as much as I would this Monstera. And when you get a plant, you want to look at and ask your plant shop owners or go online and research and seeing, hey, does this plant like to be fully teased out with the roots, or does it prefer being a little bit more root bound? So with that in mind, we're going to get this guy out of here, and then we're going to take a look at what this root system actually looks like. And this is why I have my tarp, so that I don't make a tremendous mess, but mess is inevitable. So what I'm gonna do first to get this out, and I wanna be very delicate here, but I'm gonna grab at the base, and I'm gonna press around the sides just to feel how soft it might be. And my goal is to slide it right out, and sometimes they come right out pretty easily, and other times they don't. But this one is gonna be pretty good. So I pop this out. Perfect. I'm gonna put my excess soil in the pot that I'm gonna be using. Now we're ready to go. Okay, so our plant, lift it up. We see that it's not too root bound. You can kind of see here that there's roots, but nothing is too crisscrossing, nothing is really constricting, nothing is wrapped around the planter fully. So I'm not too worried about breaking up these roots, and it actually should be pretty easy. That said, remember this is a plant that is gonna enjoy being a little bit more root bound, so I'm really not gonna get too aggressive with it. What I'll start with is just knocking off the loose soil on top, because I wanna see exactly where that root system is. So as I'm going about this, I'm just literally just brushing off some of the soil, seeing what falls off naturally. I'm not adding a lot of pressure. I'm just seeing sort of where the loose points are, and all this soil I will reuse and pop back into the planter at some point. Now, when I say tease out the roots, what I mean by that is I would literally be grabbing here and pulling apart. And I'm not gonna do too much of this because, again, this is a plant that doesn't need a lot of that, but I'm just gonna just press a little on the sides, move it around a bit. I'm not gonna add very much pressure, and I'm just gonna knock away anything that's too loose and just collect all this dirt at the bottom. And this is it's a very cathartic experience for me personally. I enjoy this process of getting your hands dirty and feeling, the earth with the plants. And it's funny. There's actually a study done with folks who were in two different conditions where they were asked to repot a plant or do some kind of screen task. And the ones that did the screen task were significantly more stressed out than those who were just going about their business minding the plant. The ones who were repotting the plant actually felt decreases in stress, so it actually is a big mental health boost. Typically what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna make sure that the plant itself is not full of soil that it shouldn't have already. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure the soil is relatively loose and matches the plant that we're discussing here. Now, if this were something like an orchid or something like a cactus, you would want something that's a little bit looser in terms of a soil base, and we're gonna talk about what those mediums look like. But I don't want anything that's gonna be too clumpy, too clay-based. I want it to feel loose under my fingers, and if I go like this, then I should be okay. If there is anything specific that you think shouldn't be there, like rocks or bits of plastic or whatever it might be, definitely get that out of there, and we're gonna be using all new soil anyway, so it's not gonna be a problem. So now that I have this all set up, I haven't teased out the roots too much, but this feels pretty good to me. There's a couple roots hanging out, it's not too broken up, and it still feels very much intact. So then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna prep my pot. So, again, remember, we talked about the drainage hole. Now, other plant people might look at me like I'm a psycho because there's no drainage hole in this planter, and I'm planting a very finicky plant in the Fiddly fig inside here. So that's okay. My Fiddly fig I have downstairs, which is about 7.5 feet tall, no drainage hole. had it for 2.5 years. It's doing great. So with that in mind, how do we recreate the right conditions for proper drainage? And it starts with these. So these, I don't know if you can see these here, these are lava rocks. And lava rocks are different than a lot of the other stones that you'll see used in gardening or plants. And the lava rocks in particular are specific for me because they are very porous. So if I were to put normal garden stones or something here that would just create a layer of drainage between the roots and any standing water, that would be in theory fine. But the problem is if there's continued standing water there and it doesn't go anywhere, then those roots are just going to end up sitting in there. And if you water a little bit extra, then you're probably in trouble. So what the lava rocks do is they actually give you some forgiveness. And if you were to touch these, you can actually feel that they're a little bit almost damp and they're porous. So if I water, and I water maybe a little too much, that water that's sitting down in these rocks is going to get absorbed. And I don't have to worry too much about my plant struggling through because I'm pretty confident that the lava rocks are going to pick up any of that excess moisture that might be down there. So with that in mind, I've layered a 2-inch layer of these lava rocks in here, which you can kind of see down there. And then I'm going to now add some soil on top. Now, I get a big question about how much soil should go on the bottom versus how much soil should go on the top once the plant is inside. Now, this totally depends on a few factors. Number one is you always want to have at least I usually shoot for 3 or 4 inches of soil at the bottom just so that the roots have somewhere to go. If I just put a 1-inch layer of soil and there's the lava rocks right down there, the chances of it expanding its root system downward is probably going to be pretty small. So I want to put at least 3 or 4 inches down, depending on the height of the pot too. That also makes a difference. So I'll be putting this excess soil that I have here, I'm putting it in the pot right now just to make sure. And then I'm going to test. I'm going to say, okay, was that really 3-4 inches? Probably not. So I'm going to add some more soil. And this is one of my favorite soil brands. This is Fox Farm. I also use Espoma, which is a really sustainable brand as well. Use them for my outside garden for a lot of things. So this is one that's kind of all-purpose and does a really great job of providing that light, airy mixture. And I don't really need to amend it. I use it for almost all of my plants, and they are very, very happy. So I'm going to add some of this in here just to create another layer. And then I'm going to assess and see what height we're working with and see if the plant is ready to go. So if I put this in here, I see that I've added too much soil, right? This is going to be popping out of the top, so I'm going to actually take some out. And this is just a guessing game, right? You just want to do trial and error and see okay, here's where my plant is sitting in the pot, and where do I actually want it to sit in the pot in comparison to the top of the edge here. Now my goal is to have at least 1 inch between the rim of the planter and then the top of the plant. Reason being is when I water, I don't want that water to just scoot right off and create a mess. I want there to be at least some give so that if I do water, there's no spillage or anything like that, and the water will never come out over the pot. So I'm going to remove some of these, some of the soil, and I might actually remove some of the lava rocks. I may have put too many in here to start with, and that's okay. It's easy fix. Very easy fix, but they certainly add a bunch of inches to the top. So just be aware of that. So then once I feel like I'm in a better place, I can put this down. Let's assess my height now. Feeling a little bit better about that. Maybe add a few more adjustments. So one thing that I will say that it's important to mention is that when you are repotting, and if you are thinking that your soil needs amending, or you don't have the greatest soil to begin with and want to make a change, that is totally fine. It might be a little scary the first time you make your own soil mix, but there's plenty of really useful tools online and materials that you can get that will make your life really easy. One of my favorites is something called perlite, which I have over here. I hate that it comes in plastic, but I reuse it as much as I can. But this is just basically like white powder stone, and this allows to create more aeration in the soil. And this is really helpful for me if I've got a soil that's very clumpy. Remember, a lot of these plants like to dry out completely between waterings. So this is something that will allow for that water to pass through, and I don't want there to be too much water retention. Now, if there's a plant like the calathea, the begonia, that really actually do like a little bit more moisture, then maybe I'd add less of this because I don't want to have the water, pass and go too quickly. So feel free to amend your soil depending on what you see fit. And when you're repotting, it's a great time to try something new. So I've now adjusted my height here, hopefully enough that it makes a significant difference. And I'm gonna pop this in here, and that feels pretty good to me. Just gonna break off some of the soil on top. And now it's time to pack in the soil on the sides. Now, when I do this, I really don't want to, have it be too loose along the side. Actually, I'll pack it in pretty good. I'm not too worried about the aeration right now. What I'm most worried about is just making sure that the plant is secure in the planter. There's nothing worse than having your plant already in there and then all of a sudden you water it and it starts tilting over because it wasn't secure in the first place. So I'm gonna be taking handfuls of this and I'm just rotating it around, making sure that it maintains the right height, making sure that it stays upright the way I want it to look. And I'm just putting this down and I'm squeezing in on the sides. So this is, as you can see, a very dirty process. And typically, if I were doing this not on camera, I'd have some kind of box or a planting station with rims on the sides so that pickup is pretty easy. The tarp still makes it easy, but for the viewers at home, wanted to make sure that this was pretty clear. And I'm just going around on all sides and I'm planting this and it feels awesome. Looks pretty straight to me. You guys can be the judge of that. But this is coming in here pretty nicely. So now that I have a pretty good base and I'm not worried about it falling over, then I can actually take this and go around the edges if I want and fill it in entirely. So I'm just gonna pour some in here on all sides, just to make sure I'm getting everything coming around each edge. And remember, leaving that 1 inch gap for watering. Almost there, just probably a little bit more. And then I should be good. All right. Well, that looks pretty darn good. I'm very happy with that. Awesome. I've been waiting to repot this guy for a week in anticipation for this class. So we have officially repotted our first plant, and this is the Fiddly fig, right? This is something that is going to need lots of sun. I'm not going to want to move it. Whew, dirt in the face. Pretty typical. But I'm going to put this in a bright sunny spot. Might put it underneath my skylights over there. But I have repotted this plant. It feels good. I'm going to give it some water now, and then I'm going to feel in a really good spot moving forward that this plant is set up for success. Now, one thing that's really important to note is that there is a concept called potting up versus repotting. Now, the differences are a little bit subtle, but it's important to know the difference because some plants you might want to pot up and others you might want to do a full repot. So what I mean by potting up is actually probably a little bit more similar to what I did here, especially with plants that like to be a little bit more root bound, where I am not removing tons and tons of soil from the plant. For the most part, that root ball and everything that's in there is maintaining the soil that was there, and then I'm adding a bigger pot and adding new soil around it. That is more of a true potting up. If I were doing a real repot, I would take a plant and really break it down until there were just roots that I was seeing. And you can do this with a lot of plants, and a lot of plants are perfectly fine with that. And it's a great thing to do if you're worried that you have pests, or if you have bad soil, or if you just want to repot a plant and just have it have a fresh start. These are things that are pretty easy to do. And I'll show you an example of something that we would do more so that would be a more of that teasing out of the roots. So here I'll show you my Rhaphidaphra tetrasperma, which is a really cool plant that is totally different than probably a lot of things that you've seen. It kind of looks like the Monstera, but it's not related. It's kind of fake in comparison, but still just as beautiful. Now this is something that has been in this tiny little pot for quite a while. And I want to put it in this new pot that I have over here. And you know that this is ready for a repot because you can see in there, you can see those roots coming out, and it is ready. Like, it has been in here for quite some time. And I bet you if I pull this out, and we're gonna see how that comes, we're gonna try and lay it on its side and see how we do. Let's see. Let's see how it does. Come on now. Man, it is really in here. Hold on. Sometimes you really have to get your hands in there and work it around. It's much easier to repot when you're using a nursery pot because the sides are plastic, so you can bend them or you can cut them. But with new plant or plants that have been in pots for a while, it can be very tricky. So we're gonna pull this out here. Here we come. Come on. Come on, baby. There you go. Now look at this. That is a whole root system here. And I didn't lose too many roots here, and the roots that I did lose were very small. But you can see that this cutting was given to me, and now we have all of these roots here, which have taken a long time to grow, actually. This has been over a year, but it looks very healthy. So you can see the difference now. So you can see here all these roots that came out of this note, and this is more of a true repot. It's not holding on to a lot of soil. It needs a little bit more support. And so I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it in this planter. Now I've already prepped it. I've already put my lava rocks in there, and I've already put in some soil. So right now it's about just finding the right spot for it and then giving it some support. Now, I have not left my house in a few days and neglected to get a trellis, so I'm gonna have to add that afterwards. But it's always better to add a trellis in the repotting phase. The reason being is you don't want to put a new plant down, cover it with soil, the roots get comfortable, and then you're sticking a knife through the soil basically and risking damaging some of those roots. So next time, don't do this, but I'm gonna repot this after anyway once I get the trellis. But for here, you can see these roots are exposed, and now I'm gonna add in all of my new soil. And this is a plant that is really beautiful. It's going to keep growing nice and tall, and I wanna make sure that it is in the best condition possible, and it will need to climb towards the sun. So let's see, got a couple questions here. How important is it to completely get rid of the soil when repotting? Tend to blast it under the sink to get rid of all the dirt, and then I'll blast the roots with 1:1 ALC in order to get rid of pests. That's totally fine. It's probably a safer thing to do. I get lazy sometimes and I don't worry about it if, especially if I bought it from a reliable provider or vendor. That said, there are always instances where you're gonna get pests. So if you wanna treat the soil and you wanna get rid of all of the soil that came with the plant, that is totally fine. I have found though that no matter what, even if you're getting plants and new soil and plastic or whatever it is, there are still pests. They're everywhere. It's really hard to combat them. Some of them are coming inside or coming from outside. Some of them are coming from the plants that you already have inside. It can be a challenge no matter what. So keep that in mind as you go about it. If you want to save yourself some time, like I always tell plant parents, I'm like, listen, like dealing with the pests is inevitable. Like it's gonna happen. You're gonna have to go through it, and it's sort of like a rite of passage. Like, okay, this is my first fungus gnat situation. This is my first spider mite situation, and you know, no plant is perfect. So just be aware that that is going to happen, and I just want you to be prepared for that, because treating the soil, you can do it all you want, and it still might not make a difference. So let's just make sure this guy is good. Let's get him all in here. He looks much happier now. And remember, this one also was a pot without a drainage hole. So all that growth from a cutting, careful watering, lava rocks on the bottom, and he was just fine. This new planter actually I picked up a couple weeks ago does have a drainage hole, which is fine. I still use the lava rocks because it's very helpful and will ensure even better drainage throughout the tray. So there we go. Our plant is ready to roll. I'll probably give this guy a water, and because he doesn't have a trellis, I will put him back here and lean him against the wall for now, looking oh so fabulous. Boom. How easy was that? Awesome. It doesn't look easy because I'm covered in dirt and my dad's probably gonna kill me because I got the attic all messy, but that is repotting, right? We have successfully repotted 2 plants, two plants in different ways. One that was a little bit more root bound, and one that was truly a full-on repot where we could tease out and pull out those roots any way we could. I see another question here. Hold on. I tend to end up stripping the roots back like the big stems because the finer roots get ripped off when washing. How much damage am I doing to the plant though? Good question. So a lot of the plants that we're getting for houseplants have fibrous roots versus a tap root, which is if you cut the main tap root, then the plant's not going to survive, versus the fibrous roots where if you clip a couple of them off, it's not going to be the end of the world. That being said, it's important to look and assess what roots are healthy and the size of those roots to begin with. So much like we humans have veins and arteries and capillaries, right? Some of those are more important than others. So if you see really thick roots that are starting out at the base of the plant, those are probably roots that are a little bit older, more developed, and are leading out to those smaller roots towards the bottom. So if you can avoid any of those roots when you are washing or clipping the roots during the repotting, I would highly recommend it. I've seen instances where those roots get cut and the plants struggle a little bit, if not die. So be careful of that. And then I would also say, if you do see any roots that are kind of blackened or soft or mushy, they've probably suffered from root rot. So it's okay to cut those out completely, because now you're going to set up your plant with a fresh root system and one that's not already on the way out. But very, very good question. So before we head over to our propagation, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the materials that we're using here and see how we can potentially amend our soil. Now remember, this Fox Farm soil that we have here, very loose and very good for letting the water pass through. Now that I planted here, I'm going to pack it in. And if I'm worried that it might be too compacted, I would poke holes with either my finger or a chopstick or something like that to allow the water to flow through effectively. And if I were to look at this soil just by itself, and I encourage you all to do this too, just take a little handful from any of the plants that you have at home and just start dissecting it. And you can look through and you can see the actual size of the particles and the sediments that make up your soil. And this is really important because your plant is only as good as the soil that it's in. And I cannot stress that enough. Good soil can make a great plant unhealthy in a matter of weeks. So I'm looking at my soil here and I see a lot of things. I see bits of perlite. I see bigger sticks and chunks here. I'm seeing some rocks. I'm seeing wood chips. I'm seeing different types of particles here that tell me that there's going to be good aeration in the soil. Now, if I were to pick this up and it was muddy or clumpy or difficult to work through my hands, not friable or granular, as soil scientists would say, then I'm a little bit more concerned. I'm concerned that it's going to hold on to too much water, and my typical watering schedule, which might be on a weekly basis, would be very much affected. So there's two things you can do if that's the case. If you have a situation where you are worried about the soil being too clay-based or too muddy, you can either amend the soil, which I would recommend more than anything, or you can change your watering schedule and be much more attentive to how much you're watering and probably end up watering less. So if we were to amend the soil, what I would do, and we can show it here, I would have my soil and then I'd be putting it in here. I'm seeing how it balances out. And then I would take my perlite. I would take cocoa coir. I would take orchid bark. And this is another good, useful thing here too, right? These are things that are going to create more space between the soil. Now these are just like bits of orchid bark, and they're huge chunks actually, because the orchids really don't need water and soil in the traditional sense because they've got aerial roots that are clinging to surfaces and absorbing water and nutrients that way. So this is more similar to what an orchid would like, but you can actually use it to amend your own soil. And if you go through your own soil at home, you'll probably notice that there's probably some orchid bark in some of the soil mixtures that you currently have. So I would take some of this, I would add it to my soil, I would add the perlite, I would mix it in together. And then once I felt like my soil was at a really good place in terms of the consistency and the moisture and sort of this balance of different mediums, then I'm ready to plant. And remember, not every plant needs the same exact soil I don't typically mix my soils unless I'm doing something very specific with the plant, or I've seen a plant that I've purchased that really is struggling. But just be aware of some of these things as you're going about the process, just because you don't want to end up spending a lot of money on a plant and then getting crappy soil that is not good for your plant, also not good for your environment. I tend to stay away from Miracle-Gro just because it's Monsanto owned and not the greatest company in terms of caring for our planet and our land. So Fox Farm is great. Espoma is fantastic. If you have questions about other soil brands that you might have, just shoot me a message or DM. Happy to answer any of those. But typically, I'm using Fox Farm and Espoma, and I have no issues with my plants. All my plants seem very, very happy. So I'm ready to move on to propagation, but if anyone has another question, please put it in the chat, or we can wait until the end of the session, but speak now or we're moving on. I think we're good, but just in case, give it 30 more seconds while I figure out what I'm gonna bring down here. Okay, and I actually might bring you up to my propagation station so you can see what I'm working with here. But I'm just gonna wipe off the endless amount of dirt on me first. Okay, so we've repotted a plant. Boom, we're in good shape. Now we have our plants at home, and let's say maybe we are in quarantine and we can't go to Home Depot or Whole Foods where they have plants, and we really want to get a new plant and figure out what we can propagate or clone. And this is going to be a lot of fun and a little bit tricky depending on what you're trying to propagate. So propagation by itself is just the process of cloning a plant, and it can be done a variety of ways. You may have heard of division, or even grafting, or taking cuttings. Cuttings are typically the most popular way of doing it, although there are some plants that will shoot up little plant pups, and you can just divide them and cut them at their root systems and then put them in soil or water, and they're pretty good to go. So depending on what plants you have, you might see different things, but we're going to talk about cuttings for the most part and how to allow them to grow roots in water or sphagnum moss. Now, there are many different growing mediums that can be used to encourage root growth. I typically do most of mine in water, although I know people who swear by sphagnum moss, which I'll show you here in a minute. It's just a different method of doing it, and some plants actually, because like succulents are in this category too, are so resilient and so strong, you can literally cut off a succulent leaf, put it on top of soil, and roots will naturally come out like crazy. And when that happens, it's awesome. But other plants need a little bit more help in order to get going. And the key is first identifying where to make your cutting in the first place. So we're gonna go on a little adventure here. So you can see this is my little plant studio that I've got going on. And we're gonna go over here to my friend, the Pothos. So this is something that can be propagated very easily. And it's great because if I wanted to propagate this, I could do it in a way. Hold on, my tripod, there we go. Come on now. All right, here we go. So you can see this here, and this is really easy to propagate, and it can be done at any length. And it makes it awesome if you want to have a plant that is already kind of established, but still, has room to grow. So what I'm gonna look for here are the nodes. So if I'm coming in here, I wanna find the brown nubby bits that are on the back side of each leaf stem or petiole right here. So I see that. That is a node. And that is what I would want to cut, and that is what I would want to put in water. Once that is submerged, I'm gonna feel really good about its chances at propagating, because that's where the plant DNA is. That's where I want those plants to be submerged, put it in a warm, sunny spot. Some people even use heat mats, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. And we're actually gonna come over here and check out the propagation station. So I will bring this over, and you can see this here. Hold on one second, bear with me. Boom. All right, so you see a lot of glass jars here, and we've got a couple different things happening. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull out this cutting that we just talked about with the Pothos. So this Pothos here, and this is funny, this is an old candle holder that I have turned into my propagation station, and it looks awesome. And I've got a bunch of things propagating here. But I'm first gonna pull out the pothos, since that's what we discussed before. So this is the pothos. I just cut it earlier today, so you're not gonna see roots, but what you can see is where that node is. Hopefully you can see that there, yeah. So that brown nubby bit is where those roots are gonna come out of. So I'm gonna keep that in soil in there, and then I can see where I've propagated my Monstera Peru, where there have been a lot of success. So you can see here that from that node, I have a root. And that is the goal. And it's funny, you take the cuttings from similar plants and you look at how they react, and the Monstera Peru, 3 out of the 4 cuttings took, and the other ones didn't. This next one here, I'm looking at some ivy that I pulled from my backyard, which is growing like crazy. And this literally, I mean, it's not a special plant, but very easy to propagate. If we're going to look at something like the snake plant over here, this is something that's a little bit trickier, right? This is something that I've got roots growing, but the thing about this, hold on, let me just pull you back up here, and I'll bring you over here because I think it's better with the glare. But the thing about this that is pretty cool is that the snake plant needs not a lot of water, which we've discussed. So if you were to cut this leaf, right? Not even a node, there's no node here that you're gonna see. You cut this leaf, and if you were to put it in water right away, it would probably die very quickly. Reason being, it would soak up so much of that water, and then this would turn to mush, and then it would essentially be destroyed. So what you do for a snake plant is you make this cut, and then you make a kind of like a triangle cut, and then you let it sit on the windowsill for 3 days. Don't touch it. And you're like, how is that possibly going to help the plant? Like, there's no way. But what that does is it allows that wound to sort of callus over and prevent the water from sort of taking over the entire leaf. And once that callusing happens, pop it in soil, and boom, now I have a new plant. I could literally stick this in any of the soils that I have, and that plant is going to be ready to go. Now, the ones up there that we discussed are more so the node clippings. And I'm gonna go pull that one up here because I wanna show you in a better angle so you can see it. So I'll bring this one down, and then I'll bring the other one down after. And I've done this also with my big old Monstera here, which you can see, which is a giant. She has successfully been propagated as well. And I'm gonna pull down, let's pull down this because this is easier to show. All right, hold on 1 second. Okay, so we're back. Cool. All right, here we go. I see a question. Let's see. Do you ever use newt water to prop in, or just always tap water? That is a fantastic question, and something I was just about to talk about. So, mason jar. Used to be a salsa jar, right? This is super easy to use. I put it in water, and I didn't add anything to this. I didn't use any root hormone. I didn't use any special newt, which is one of the type of fertilizers you have. Monsteras are really easy to propagate. So in most situations, I would say you don't need it, but it depends on the type of plant and how delicate it might be. And you can always increase your chances or expedite the process if you're using something that has a rooting hormone, which is called auxin. It's also responsible for plants growing and leaning towards light, and it's responsible for root growth. So if you have that, that's great. Totally cool. But if you're giving it the right conditions, and I see a question here about the right conditions, I want to make sure that it's warm and sunny. That was a south-facing window. And once I moved them from my east-facing window to my south-facing window, they took off like crazy. I literally put this in water maybe 3 days ago, and I've already got action coming out of that node. And that's exciting, right? I mean, they make the best gifts. I'm gonna be sending a bunch of these Monstera Adansoni clippings as well. You can see this is a different type of Monstera. Hold on, let me pull out. Hold on, this is my my string of bananas, which took off literally in like 2 days once I moved it up there. But you can see here that I've got some good action on my Monstera adansonii, and propagation is a fantastic way to salvage plants. So had a horror story with this plant, one of my favorite plants. I went away, my mom was responsible for watering. Push comes to shove, the plant lost, and it was in bad shape when I found it. That being said, I didn't give up on it. I didn't throw it immediately in the compost pile. I cut it up at each of these nodes, and now I have a new plant. Really, it's not a new plant, it's the same plant, but it has a new chance at life. So if there are any plants in your collection that are struggling or you're really worried about, hold on, I want to be careful about moving this in here. But if there's any plants that are struggling and you want to kind of salvage them and you're not sure if they're going to survive, take a cutting, take 3 or 4, cut it up. Like, the plant's going to appreciate being alive versus you just totally giving up on it in the first place. So I've got maybe 4 or 5 cuttings from this Monstera adansonii here. And then I threw in a couple other plants here. This is my string of bananas, which kind of looks like a little pitchfork right now, but these are super easy. And when I'm sending them to people, I'll either put them in a glass jar, wrap them around with like a moist paper towel, maybe put some tinfoil over that to maintain the moisture, and then I'll send them out to people, and they make great little gifts. When I go over to people's houses, I'll bring a mason jar full of water and a bunch of cuttings. It's an awesome little centerpiece, and they can keep that forever. Hold on, I'm seeing a couple questions here. I got a surprise icon a few days ago. I really don't want to kill it. I've never had much luck with spag moss. Do you think water would be okay? You know, I think water would be okay, depending on what type of plant, as I mentioned before, and your conditions that you're giving it. If you have a heat mat, that always increases the chances of it working. Whether it's germination or propagation, that's always a good thing to have on hand. But you know, if spag moss hasn't worked for you, I've been burned by spag moss a couple times, where it just held on to moisture too much and actually caused the roots to rot. But I know people who swear by it. So whatever way you're feeling most comfortable, and if you've tried something that hasn't worked and your cutting isn't rotted or dead, try switching it up and see what happens. Can cuttings also work with fiddle leaf fig trees? Yes. Now the cutting there is a little bit different. Now that's probably going to be a little bit more similar to what we would look at in the snake plant, right, where we're cutting a leaf. So if I were to cut and propagate this fiddle leaf fig tree, what I would do is I would cut right here. And I wouldn't do it with a newer stem. I'd probably do a stem that was a little bit older, a little bit woodier, and I would put that in water. I've propagated them a couple different times, but it's not, I haven't had the most success with it. It's something that takes a long time to begin with, and you've got this awkward one leaf sitting in soil, and it grows, don't get me wrong, it grows, but in general, they're a little bit more picky than some of the other ones. Pothos propagate like crazy. The snake plants are super easy. The monsteras are super easy. And honestly, like, if you just want to try something, just start cutting stuff. If you have to prune a giant monstera like I do frequently, and I'm making decisions about what parts of the plant are going and which ones are not, I'm constantly propagating and giving them to friends. So it makes it really, really easy. See another question here. I've heard adding Pothos cutting to another cutting increases its root growth. Fact or myth? So I don't know the answer 100%, so I'm gonna have to dive into that because that's a great question. But what I would say, if I had to guess, I would say it probably would, just because let's say one cutting was stronger than another and was releasing more of that auxin, that hormone that is gonna produce some of those roots. I'd feel really good if the other cutting that's in there, if it wasn't as strong, was using some of that hormone as well. So I'm sure it might increase the chances. I usually am doing them all together, like 3 or 4 in one cup or vial. So I would say that If I had to guess, I'd say it'd be fact, but I'd have to look into the science on that. It's a good question. And then another one, have you ever notched your Monstera for new growth points? I have not, just because I like things very kind of wild and overgrown. So I'll show you here what I'm working with. So this Monstera is just, it's giant, right? I mean, it's pretty big. It's leaning heavily right now because it needs a repotting. But if we go down into the depths here, you can kind of see how I've trellised it. Hold on. And you can see all these different nodal points, right? And these are where the aerial roots are coming out of. And these aerial roots are incredibly long right now. And if these were allowed to touch soil, they would take root. And that's what's called an adventitious root, meaning that it would be something where the plant is trying to secure itself a little bit more. But this obviously is not in a jungle, right? It's in a pot, so those roots are going to trail. I can cut those if I want, or if I can take it and, repot it or, propagate it, it'd be really easy to do that with some of those roots. How long did it take it to grow so tall? That is a good question. I rescued this one from a family that was moving maybe 2 years ago. It was probably about half the height. And it's grown like crazy. My other Monstera, which I've had since it was a child, just a wee seedling, this was after about 1.5 years, and it was literally like this tall, if you can see that there. So this has taken off tremendously. I've gotten my first couple fenestrated leaves. This one's a new one that came out recently. So it just takes time. It depends on your conditions, but I highly would recommend propagating and just seeing the results, right? I mean, we talked a lot about, doing experiments last class and seeing what works for you and what doesn't, and getting multiple of the same type of plant and putting them in different conditions. Propagating is the easiest way to do that. Like if I'm gonna go and see okay, can my Monstera survive here? I might take a cutting from that Monstera that's in a condition that it really likes, propagate it, put it in that other area. If it survives, great. I know I can survive. I know I can keep a Monstera healthy there. So propagating allows you to have some freedom and flexibility. And if you have the right environment, or if you want to manufacture that with grow lights or a heat mat, or even just some of that rooting powder, which I don't use but probably should, it'd be a really easy way to just start creating a little bit more expansive plant family as well. And before I get to this next question, I wanted to show another example of propagation here, which is my aloe. Now, this is a Home Depot plant right here, which you can see. It's a gorgeous little plant. But this, when I got it, literally was maybe, hold on, I'll turn this way so the glare is not so horrible. But this plant was maybe 6-7 inches tall when I first got it. And it would constantly shoot up little pups, which would appear in the soil right here. And there's no pups right now, but I would take these pups and I would put them in soil, or I'd put them in water, make sure they had a little bit more root system, and they would be propagated. So this is not actually the original plant that I bought at Home Depot. This is its clone. The other one I sold when I moved because it was way bigger. So this started out as a 3-inch pup, propagated it, and this spring and summer it's probably going to have maybe 3 or 4 more of these pups coming up, every month or so. And they're great little gifts. I give them to people all the time. And that's just an example of how to divide versus propagate through a cutting like this. Cuttings like this, I've cut myself, and they don't already have an established root system. Those are actually roots to begin with. So cutting those makes it really easy to take care of and create new plants for yourself. Let's see, a couple more questions here. What plant tape do you use? Great question. Very good question. So if you come in here, we'll go under the jungle again. Sorry, this is my daily spot, just on the floor in the understory. So you can kind of see here, see this green tape, kind of looks like Velcro. It's because it is Velcro. This is green garden tape, and I posted a video on my Instagram a couple weeks ago about how to train your Monstera. And I don't like moss poles because I think they're just like offensive looking, but they're probably the best way because those roots will cling onto that sphagnum moss and they'll help it climb. I use tomato stakes. I'm a gardener by trade, right? So I used to use these for my tomatoes. I still use them for my tomatoes, and you can't really see them because they're so dark green, and I use the green Velcro just to keep them in place, and it's reusable. So I don't need to worry about cutting it. Don't need to worry about throwing it away. Makes it really easy to train my Monstera, and this is definitely due for a repotting with some bigger stakes, because as you can see, it's leaning very heavily in one direction. So gonna have to fix that up pretty soon, but good question. And then another question here. I got my aloe 2 years ago, grew a ton first year. It was mature, but it didn't grow much this past year. Also, I've never gotten any pups. Any idea why? So this is a good question, because this leads to why we might want to repot in the first place. So again, there's that sort of 12 to 18 month time frame where it's encouraged to repot. That Monstera or that aloe is probably due for a repotting as well. But if your plant, you're seeing roots coming out at the bottom, if you're seeing roots coming out at the top, if the growth has stunted, or if it suddenly starts struggling out of nowhere, it could be just time for a new home, a little change of pace in their environment. So that would be my best recommendation. But if you think there might be something else and want to play around with something, maybe some fertilizer or something like that, now is a good time to start your fertilization schedule. I just started last week, now that the weather's a little bit warmer and the plants are going to be ready for some intense growth. So only make one change at a time. And if you want to start with repotting, that's great. I think if you've had it for 2 years, I think it's probably time for a repot, and the plant will appreciate it. So if there are any other questions, I will field them now. But this was a fun class, and I got on the floor, I got my hands dirty. I hope you were following along at home, maybe getting your own hands dirty, prepping some plants for this weekend. But if there are no other questions, I will bid you adieu and say that I hope you have a wonderful plant weekend. Remember, keep supporting Pildora Live. They've been fantastic and providing so much amazing, sustainable content for us all during this very challenging social distancing time. One more question and then we'll go. How do you fertilize your plant? Oof, we're not gonna have to talk about that. We're gonna have to talk about that next week, but I'll give you a hint. It has to do with 3 letters, and those letters are NPK. This is Super Thrive. This is what I use, but you'll have to tune in next week for our plant troubleshooting class, where we talk about all things plant care and fertilization. So thank you, everyone. Hope you have a safe and healthy weekend, and keep growing. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed that video and want to watch it live, head to www.pildoralive.com to get your free membership today and join us in daily live classes surrounding sustainability, mindfulness, and positive environmental impact. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a beautiful day. Bye.